The corridor of the Ben Pasteur Orphanage smells like fatty tallow candles and damp wool, and even beneath that, there's a hint of something sour and rotting that no amount of incense on Sunday ever quite reaches. Sister Marguerite has walked this hallway hundreds of times. She knows which floorboards creak and the sound of the dormitory door makes when the wind comes through the gap at the bottom. And she even knows the difference between the silence of girls who are like literally sleeping and the silence of girls who are just pretending to sleep. But today, something is different. She stops before really knowing why until she hears it. A thud. Heavy, like weight on weight. It all happened so fast, and before her brain can really catch up, the screaming has started. Sister Marguerite moves swiftly, before even really knowing what she's running towards. She runs past the refectory and the row of wooden pegs where the girls hang their coats. And when she pushes through the dormitory door, she sees them. Girls everywhere, breathless, all talking at once. And in the middle of them is Christine Papin, 8 years old, and Sister Bernadette's fist is already locked around Christine's collar, pulling her off of the girl that's lying on the cold stone floor. "That one," the crowd of girls say, pointing to the puddle of human laying on the stone floor. "She pinches us until we bleed every day, anytime she feels like it, for a whole year." Sister Marguerite realizes it wasn't Christine that this crowd was afraid of, it's the girl on the floor. And that's the part she won't be able to shake later. Not the fight itself or the accused girl on the floor, and not even the year of quiet suffering nobody had said a word about, but rather what she saw right in front of her. A child who just got caught fighting should be panicking right now. This will certainly earn Christine the rod against her palms, in the refectory, in front of everyone for that little bit extra added bit of shame. The way it's always done. Maybe a night or two in the dark, cold dungeon. Maybe some stale bread underneath the door should straighten her right up. There's no saving Christine from her punishment. But Christine's eyes are steady, fixing on one thing. Her 6-year-old sister Leia, standing a few feet away, small and unhurt, gazing up at her big sister like she could do no wrong. Sister Marguerite follows that gaze back to Christine, and something she can't quite name moves through her. Sister Marguerite will write behavioral incident in the record, of course, but she will not write what she actually saw in Christine's eyes that day because she doesn't really have the words for it yet. Christine doesn't look like a girl who just did something naughty. She looks like a girl who just finished something. Not an 8-year-old child who lost control, but cool and calculated in her attempt at righting an injustice. This is part 1 of the Christine and Leia Papin story, the two sisters who found each other again after years apart, and who, once reunited, brutally murdered 2 women, they claimed, in self-defense. It's 1901 in the deep rural heart of Sarthe, France, and a somber and shy 26-year-old man named Gustave Papin is working alongside his father, Prosper Papin, about 21 kilometers away at a weaving workshop in Bret-les-Pins. They had a good relationship and the Papin family was close. In fact, later that night, Mother, Father, and Gustave Papin would sit in the common room together after dinner and talk about their day. But 2 very uncommon things were about to happen that night. 1, Gustave would make an announcement, and 2, he would fly into a violent rage. His parents have never seen Gustave like this before. He's animated, flushed, tripping over his words. This shy, somber man who has never given them a moment's trouble is suddenly ridiculous with love, hopelessly embarrassing, completely gone over someone. And just the year before, on his 25th birthday, his own mother had told him, "Gustave, it's time. Find a nice woman. Settle down, start a family." Well, he found someone, and he told his parents her name. The Papin parents exchanged a look, not a happy one. So you know how in America there's a deep south? It's rural in ways that go way beyond just the geography. These are places where the same families have lived on the same land, sometimes in the same house, for hundreds of years. Everyone knows everyone, especially your personal business, and outsiders are regarded with suspicion. The opposite of New York, say. Well, France has one too. the deep France, called La France Profonde, and the Department of Sarthe is in the heart of it. Imagine the opposite of everything Paris represents. No cafes, no couture, no avant-garde stuff, just land, church, family, and the particular kind of suffocation that comes from everyone knowing exactly who you are and exactly who your great-grandmother was. That's La France Profonde. And in 1901, it was home to roughly half the country. The same family names appear in the church registry generation after generation. The same plots of farmland passed down, the same feuds passed down, the same gossip passed down. Most people in Sarthe are born, live, and die within a few kilometers of the same stone cottage. And some family lines have lived in the very same house for hundreds of years. Now, in 1901, there were no cars. The train existed, but it doesn't reach everyone. But this isn't charming countryside. It's a place people get stuck in. And after a few generations of getting stuck, the villagers start to turn inward. In a place this sealed off, reputation isn't just social currency, it's a life sentence. You cannot outrun what people say about you here. There is nowhere to run to. And presiding over all of it is the church. In deep France, the priest isn't just a spiritual authority, he's social law. He decides who's respectable and who isn't. And a woman who isn't respectable in La France Profonde isn't just whispered about, she is effectively erased from decent society. No respectable family will associate with her, and certainly no respectable man will marry her. And Gustave Papin was right in the middle of it. Shy, somber, hopelessly in love, and his parents had just heard a name they recognized. Everyone in Sarthe knew the name Clémence Deré. To Gustave, Clémence was a gorgeous, charming woman working in a seed shop selling farming supplies to the locals. But Prosper Papin and his wife see nothing good in this union between their son and Clémence. They heard the rumors just like everyone else. The headstrong, flighty Clémence in a habit of seducing every fellow in the village. And his parents, who love him and want good things for him, sit across from him and say very carefully, absolutely not. Furniture met walls, things that weren't meant to be thrown got thrown. And this shy, somber, quiet man who had never given his parents a moment's trouble in 25 years stood in the middle of their common room and told them in no uncertain terms he was going to marry Clémence Deré. And that was the end of it. And then Gustave drops a bomb. Clémence is pregnant. He shouts, in any case, within the next few months, our family is going to grow. You will no longer be able to oppose the marriage. In a village where everyone knows everything and the priest keeps score, this is a massive announcement with a ticking timer. Suddenly, his parents' feelings about Clémence are completely besides the point. Ready or not, she was about to become a Papin. And on October 3rd, 1901, both just 26-year-old and halfway through a pregnancy, Gustave and Clémence stood on the steps of a small church in Saint-Mars du Tilleul and made it official. Gustave got exactly what he fought for, and he would spend the rest of his life regretting it. Somewhere between the wedding and the birth of their first child, the rose-colored glasses came off, and what Gustave found underneath them was not the gentle, tender woman he had always imagined his wife would be. Clémence was commanding and authoritarian. Gustave told himself it was the pregnancy, that she was uncomfortable, and it wasn't really her. That once the baby came, things would settle. He was very wrong. On February 12th, 1902, Émilia Clémence Papin was born, 4.5 months after the wedding. In a village where everyone counted everything, church attendance, harvest yields, and apparently months, nobody was confused about what that meant. The math was simple and conclusion obvious. And given what everyone already knew about Clémence and her particular habits before the marriage, well, the village had opinions about who Émilia's biological father actually was. Whether Gustave shared these opinions is unclear. Maybe he knew and loved her anyway. Maybe he refused to know. Maybe in the fog of being that hopelessly in love with someone, the question never quite formed clearly enough to answer. But here's what we do know. Gustave Papin looked at Émilia and claimed her as his own, biological or not. Clémence looked at her and felt nothing. No maternal warmth or instinct, no softening toward or interest in her own child. The baby arrived and Clémence remained exactly who she had always been, as though the child was simply another thing that had happened to her. Another inconvenience in a life full of them. 1904, 2 years into the marriage, Gustave Papin is sitting in front of a cafe in the town square of Saint-Mars with a drink in front of him that is certainly not his first. His hand hurts, but his pride hurts more, because Gustave had a suspicion. His new boss at the fertilizer depot was having an affair with his wife. And not just any boss. This was the same boss from the seed shop Clémence had worked at before they married. The same man she had known long before Gustave ever entered the picture. And Gustave had walked himself right into it by taking that job, because once he was there every day, it was impossible to miss. His boss sought Clémence out, and she welcomed the attention. And Gustave had to stand there and watch. So before saying anything, he watched. He tracked his boss's movements, noted when he left early, noticed when Clémence was vague about her day. He was looking for something concrete, a letter, a lie that didn't add up, a moment he could point to and say, that's proof. And he found nothing he could prove. But finding nothing and feeling nothing are two very different things. And Gustave's gut was screaming. So eventually he stopped watching and started talking directly to his boss's face. What followed was not a conversation, it was a fist fight. And so here he is, in the corner of the cafe, holding a drink in his throbbing hand, and a man who burned down every relationship he had to marry a woman who has never once looked at him the way she looks at other men. So he does what men in impossible situations have always done. He makes a plan. He decides that the three of them will move to a new village for a fresh start, away from the boss, and hopefully away from the gossip. If he can just get Clémence somewhere she knows nobody, somewhere her past can't follow her, maybe she'll finally turn towards him. He was, after all, still madly in love with her. Maybe without all of it, she'll become the woman he always believed she could be. It was the kind of plan that makes perfect sense after enough drinks. And true to his word, in July 1904, he secures a job at a sawmill in the small village of Margnes, about 56 miles from St. Mars. Fair enough. And he does all of this before saying a single word to his wife. It made a certain kind of sense. His sister Isabelle lived in Margnes, and they were close. There would be family and support. There would be none of whatever was happening back at the seed shop. And then the time comes for him to tell Clémence. He doesn't ask. The deed is done. But he does tell her, and that they have 1 month to pack everything up and close the door on St. Mars and everything in it. And Gustave, this shy, battered, quietly hopeful man, looks at his wife and says, "We'll be happier there than staying here in the village." Heartbreakingly, I think he really believed that. It would be an understatement to say that Clémence did not take the news well. She exploded into something even colder and more frightening. She flailed, raged, and then said, "You've lost your mind. Never. Do you hear me? I will never leave St. Mars. I'd sooner kill myself than leave." Notice she doesn't say, "I'd rather leave you," or "I'd rather take the children and go." She claims she'd rather end her life than move. 56 miles away from a village she spent her life scandalizing. Which raises a question Gustave was probably too hurt to ask out loud. What exactly was keeping Clémence so firmly rooted in St. Mars? Because it wasn't her marriage or their child. And that one sentence, louder than any confession and clearer than anything Gustave had failed to find during those weeks of quiet surveillance, he realized his suspicions were true. Clémence would rather die than leave the man she actually wanted. But in the same breath, that Clémence threatened to take her own life rather than leave St. Mars. She was also quietly considering divorce. The self-exit threat wasn't really despair, it was a calculation, a woman who had spent her whole life knowing exactly which lever to pull and pulling it. She wasn't done either. The words kept coming, wild, uncontrollable, her gestures flailing and enormous. Gustave stood there and watched his wife, for all her faults, become someone he didn't recognize. Her face contorted, her body shook, and at the corners of her lips, something that looked almost like foam. In this rage, Clémence suddenly turned pale, nauseous, and faint. That had been happening a lot lately, and a nagging suspicion overcame her. It wouldn't be long before she learned she was pregnant with her second child. And just like that, divorce was no longer a real option. Who was going to take on an already pregnant woman with, in all likelihood, another man's child already at home? Nobody, that's who. Clémence Papin was out of leverage, and she knew it. And so she packed up her things, took her little Émilia by the hand, and moved to Margnes. Not because she wanted to, but because for the first time in her life, Clémence had no other move left. At least, not until she was done being pregnant. The accommodation waiting for them was a single room. One room for a man, a pregnant woman, and a toddler. The walls wept dampness, and the smell was the first thing that hit you when you walked through the door. It was stifling and thick, and it settles into your clothes and your hair and your skin. You really can't wash it off. But Clémence had a plan. She only had to deal with this during the pregnancy. Once the baby came in the spring, she could finally leave. While Clémence counted down the days, Gustave worked hard at the sawmill. He was good at it. His employer had no complaints and, in fact, praised his diligence. A hard, quiet, reliable man who showed up and did what was asked of him. In the sawmill, at least, he knew exactly who he was and what was expected of him. And in the evenings, he came home to a wife who didn't want him, and a room that smelled of mildew and mold, and he loved his little daughter Émilia anyway. But he had a dream. He wished that the child his wife was carrying was a boy. Someone he could bring to the sawmill one day, let him breathe in that warm, acrid smell of fresh wood shavings, and show him how things were made. The simple inheritance of a working man, a trade, smell, pair of hands, and knew what to do with themselves. But the baby that arrived on March 8th, 1905 was not a boy. It was a girl named Christine. And Clémence, who had shown precisely no maternal warmth toward Émilia in 2.5 years, was not about to discover it now. From the moment Christine arrived, Clémence complained about the fatigue and the screaming infant in the damp, musty room with 2.5-year-old Émilia underfoot. It was all too much, and that makes sense. But Clémence had one desire, and she was not quiet about it. She wanted to be rid of the youngest one. This baby she had carried for 9 months, this girl who had not asked to have been born into this room or this marriage or this life. Clémence wanted her gone, and it was Gustave, exhausted, desperate, willing to try anything to bring peace back into that damp, stinking room, who offered the solution. "If it will make your life easier," he told her, "if it will bring back your smile, we'll give her to my sister Isabelle. I'm certain she would be delighted to raise the little one." He was trying to save his marriage, again, offering up his own daughter like a peace offering to a woman who had never once offered him anything in return. Clémence didn't hesitate for a moment. For once, she thought to herself, my husband actually has a good idea. Not "this breaks my heart" or "are we sure?" Not even a moment's pause for the infant girl in the next room who would grow up never knowing why her mother didn't want her. Christine Papin was given away at barely a month old, before she was even old enough to remember being wanted. But if she had to be given to anyone, Isabelle was the right person. Gustave's sister understood something about being handed off. She and Gustave had grown up in Sarthe, children of a mother so worn down by life that the sadness had become part of her face. Their mother had carried 13 children, and only 4 survived. And Isabelle, like so many girls born into that kind of poverty in the France Profonde, had been placed into service young. In exchange for generous wages, the Papin family hadn't hesitated long before sending her to work for an elderly woman named Madame des Ailes, 75 years old and no longer able to manage the tasks of daily life. Isabelle stayed in that job for nearly 15 years, never a complaint or problem. And when Madame died, her son did something unexpected. He gave Isabelle furniture, linens from the estate, and the tenancy of 2 rooms inside his mother's house. Just like that, at 28 years old, Isabelle Papin had something almost nobody in her world had: security. So, to make her meager ends meet, she took in sewing work for a large department store and picked up Sunday shifts at the hotel the son had inherited. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. And yet, even though with all of it, the rooms, the steady work, the small, careful life she built, there was one thing Isabelle never had stopped wanting: a child. Not a husband, though. Men, in her experience, had been nothing but problems. The idea of romantic love was gone, and the warmth of a shared home carried too many painful memories. But a child? That particular wanting had never left her. It lived somewhere deep and persistent in her, a desire for motherhood that no amount of practicality had managed to extinguish. And then her brother called. He had a baby girl who needed someone to take care of her. The allowance Gustave paid was meager, but Isabelle wasn't doing it for the money. She gave Christine fine clothes and entire Thursdays of nothing but each other's company. Walks in open air, needlework side by side, the small, unhurried joys of 2 people who had chosen each other. No outsiders or disruptions, just the 2 of them in their quiet routines. And then on Sundays each week, Isabelle would bring Christine to help at the hotel restaurant owned by the des Ailes, the son of the elderly woman Isabelle had spent 15 years caring for. He and his wife had never had children of their own, and the moment Christine walked through the door, something in them simply opened up. They welcomed her like a queen, threw themselves into the role of what Christine would come to know as her Sunday parents, attentive to her health, her progress, her games, her manners, praising her and delighting in her, watching her grow up right in front of them week after week. For a little girl whose own mother had handed her away without blinking, this was everything. After Sunday lunch, Madame would take Christine into her private room, just the two of them, and they wouldn't emerge until late in the afternoon. The documents are very careful to note that Isabelle saw nothing wrong with this, and that Christine had never complained. Isabelle claimed the child felt completely at ease, and so she never questioned it, which is probably true, but it is worth pausing on for just a moment. A wealthy older woman with no children of her own completely fixated on this particular little girl? A private room with hours behind it? Maybe everything was fine. Christine never said otherwise, but she was also under 7 years old during the time she lived with Isabelle. A child who had learned very early that the people who kept her, she needed to please. And Christine had also been taught from the very beginning that the people who took care of her were good people, that you obeyed and you didn't make things complicated. You earned people's regard and asked nothing in return. Who taught her that? Isabelle did. The person she loved most in the world and had taken her in, clothed her, walked with her on Thursdays, and brought her to Sunday lunches and let her be somebody's little queen for a day. And one afternoon, Isabelle looked at this little girl who worshipped her and told her exactly how the world worked. She said, "You see, my dear, the Dezales really are good people. Their wealth hasn't made them bad. All you have to do is obey. Be docile, be helpful, and you're all set. You earn their regard, and that is priceless. It really isn't complicated. What more could you ask for? Take it from me. We servants are the happiest people of all." And there was one more thing Isabelle passed on to Christine. Men were not to be trusted. Keep your distance and your guard up, which honestly, fair. Look at the men in Isabelle's life. Look at the men in Christine's life. The evidence was not exactly overwhelming in their favor. We don't know exactly what happened to Isabelle. She never clearly said. But you don't develop that particular kind of unshakable, bone-deep mistrust of an entire gender from nothing. Something scared her and left a mark deep enough that years later she was still making sure the little girl she loved most in the world would never have to feel it too. And I think Isabelle meant well. This wasn't control or bitterness being passed down like a bad inheritance. This was a woman who had been hurt and who had quietly rebuilt herself around that hurt, and who looked at Christine and thought, not her, not if I can help it. She was trying to protect her, I think. And Christine hung on her aunt's every word and believed her. Why wouldn't she? This was the woman who had wanted her when nobody else did. The woman who had built a whole life out of exactly what she described. Service, obedience, earned regard, and it had worked. Isabelle had 2 rooms, steady work, Sunday lunches, a little girl she loved. The system had been good to her. What Isabelle didn't know, couldn't have known really, was that she was actually handing Christine in that moment. Not wisdom or protection, a blueprint for her own erasure, that her highest purpose was to make herself useful to people and disappear into the background. And into this quiet, carefully tended life, her parents came occasionally to visit. Clémence visited rarely enough that the visits were notable simply because it didn't really happen. She would show up, barely give Christine attention, and then leave. Isabelle didn't take offense. I mean, she understood exactly who Clémence was. And Gustave visited, but he left basically feeling horribly guilty every time. The weight of what he had agreed to follow him out the door and home again. Home to Émilia, who looked just like her mother, but carried an air of gentleness and grace that Clémence never had. He gave Émilia nothing but kindness and attentiveness, and somehow that only amplified Christine's absence. Having one daughter thriving under his care made the other one's distance impossible to ignore. In his mind, there was nothing he could do about it now, except love Christine from a distance and feel the specific, particular guilt of a man who gave away something irreplaceable and knew it. Gustave had always told himself it was temporary, a practical solution to a difficult moment. And then things did improve. Shouting and arguments had become less frequent since Clémence adopted this haughty glacial air towards her husband. Sure, he's depressed by the day and he's drinking nonstop, but he earned a raise and obtained larger living quarters. He had a proposal for his wife. They could bring Christine back now. They had the room and now the money. They could be a complete family again. But Clémence wouldn't even consider it. It was out of the question for her because Gustave still hadn't understood something about his wife. All these years, Clémence wasn't waiting for conditions to improve so she could be a better mother. She was waiting for conditions to improve so she could stop being a mother altogether. She had a vision for her life, a comfortable one, lower middle class ease, enough money in her pocket, nobody pulling at her sleeve, and children? Demanding, inconvenient, relentless children? had no place in that vision, and it never had. So instead of bringing Christine home, Clémence started shedding her obligations one at a time. She got a job as a grocer and earned her own money. And look, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. A woman wanting financial independence in 1905 France? I mean, genuinely good for her. Gustave could feed himself. Also better than fine. Marriages should be equal, and he's a big boy. Émilia was old enough for the school canteen, sure. Teaching children independence is healthy. And Christine? Well, I mean, Christine was already taken care of, wasn't she, by Isabelle? But none of this was about an independent woman or raising self-sufficient children. Clémence told us exactly what it was about it in her own words. I'll finally be able to treat myself. Not her children or her family, but herself. Every obligation she shed, every responsibility she quietly set down wasn't liberation. It was Clémence doing what Clémence had always done, removing whatever stood between her and the feckless life she actually wanted. And her children were in the way. And so the two sisters grew up in the same small town of Marijne, close enough to cross paths, far enough to understand even at that age that their lives were being lived on different terms. Christine, although younger and given away, was somehow the one who moved through the town with the most open heart. If she caught a glimpse of Émilia in the schoolyard, she would break away from whatever she was doing and run to her, just to say hello and give her a little kiss. And then, because she was that kind of child, she would keep going, down to the sawmill to find her father, who would look up from his work with that bowed, guilty expression he always carried when he saw her. A kiss for him, too. And then she would even go over to the grocer, where Clémence worked, and give her a kiss as well. It's endlessly, heartbreakingly open to people who have given her every reason not to be. And then Christine would turn around and run back to Isabelle's house, the only place that had ever really been her home. August 1910. It's an intoxicating summer evening, and Christine, 5 years old now, is out with her Aunt Isabelle enjoying the town's final festivity of the season. The lanterns are being lit at dusk. Everyone is drinking red wine and dancing to the music. It's the kind of night that smells like summer ending, warm and sweet and slightly melancholy all at once. Isabelle and Christine never missed it, and 5-year-old Christine is right where she loves to be, close to her aunt, safe, part of something familiar, warm, alive, and flickering with light. And then the crowd shifts, and Christine sees her mother, Clémence. She's dancing. It's not unusual, but she isn't dancing with her father, Gustave. She's dancing with a strange man. Christine doesn't recognize him. And they're not dancing like friends might dance. They're dancing the way a 5-year-old child who doesn't really have the words for it yet understands immediately is wrong. And then came the whispers. Because in this town, in La France Profonde, there were always whispers. A disgrace, a woman with loose morals, words a 5-year-old shouldn't have to learn in reference to her own mother. And we can understand why the community said those things. Clémence had never exactly hidden her behavior. She had never seemed particularly concerned with who was watching or what conclusions they were drawing. But there is something important to sit with here that has nothing to do with whether the community was right or wrong. A 5-year-old child heard those words about her mother in public, surrounded by lanterns and music and the entire town. Children don't separate those words from themselves. At 5 years old, a mother isn't a separate person. She's part of you. And what people say about her is in some way about you, about where you come from and about what you're made of. There's no version of that doesn't leave a mark. And then it got worse. Because somewhere in the crowd that night, Gustave saw what Christine saw, and he came barreling through the dancing crowd like something had finally snapped loose in him. All the drinks and the cafes and the suspicions, all these years of loving a woman who just looked right through him, it came pouring out the moment he saw this other man. He got in his wife's face and he spewed rage and fury, and then he got in the other man's face and they had a violent brawl. Christine screamed, but nobody came to comfort her. I don't know where Isabelle was. Maybe she stepped away for a moment, but a 5-year-old little girl, just imagine it, standing there screaming because she's scared. She doesn't understand what she's seeing, and everyone's ignoring her. Just weeks ago, she had been in Isabella's quiet rooms, learning needlework, being somebody's little queen on a Sunday afternoon. And now here she was watching her parents tear each other apart in public while everyone looked. The gentle world her aunt had built around her had shattered, and Christine was beginning to understand that it had always been made of glass. But Gustave files this incident away as a bad memory, a terrible night, meaning he forgives her. He's still desperately in love with her after all, and so it made it easy to forgive her. And he claimed that Clémence was in his blood. But let's not confuse that with romantic love, okay? He's rather describing something he can't remove, something that has become biological to him. You can't get blood out of your veins by simply deciding to, and that's the trap. He knows she's destroying him, and he cannot stop wanting her anyway, and I think Clémence knew that. But if Gustave could forgive Clémence, and he always could and would, the town was a different matter entirely, because the people had seen enough. Clémence paraded her affairs through the streets. Gustave exploded publicly in response, so these two adults making their private life catastrophic made it everyone else's problem. This La France Profonde had a long memory and a low tolerance for people who would taint the social water. This was a situation of two people who'd been destroying each other, and everyone around them for years had finally had enough of it. The verdict from the townspeople was simple: leave. And so they pack up the mess of their own making again. Clémence's uncle René found them a place to stay in Le Mans, about 30 kilometers north of the town. Still, Sarthe and La France Profonde in the technical sense, but was a different creature entirely. It was a real city with wide streets, more faces, and more noise. Enough people that you could quite possibly blend in, become anonymous, or someone new entirely. Clémence didn't fight this move like she had the previous time, because she had actually been dreaming of this for 8 years, back when she was first married in that damp single room with the baby she didn't want and a husband she couldn't stand. She used to think about the city and stepping out into the afternoon, elegantly dressed, unhurried, and heading somewhere that required gloves and good shoes. She saw how the women who did this didn't have to stop and apologize for existing. That's what she wanted, and that's fair. But it was out of reach for her. And now, after 8 years of everything she felt she was dealing with, she could move there. But she would be thoroughly disappointed, because the home her uncle René had found for them was not the Le Mans Clémence had imagined. There would be no afternoon teas or elegant gloves. They were on a narrow street lined with squalid buildings and lived in an attic that was furnished with nothing but bare essentials. It was dirty and dark. The reality kind of hit her in the face. So she says to Gustave, "Can't you see we should have just come, the two of us, and left Émilia to breathe the fresh air of Margenay? Just immediately, reflexively, the children. Leave them somewhere else so that whatever vision of life that Clémence was chasing could be chased without the inconvenience of the people she had brought into the world." And Gustave responds with this: "Clémence, you know I can't do without our daughter. I've been working as a day laborer at the cardboard mill down on the quay. As soon as we're saved up a bit, we'll find something better, I promise you. Just another promise, another fresh start just around the corner, another version of the same speech. Just hold on, wait, trust me, it gets better." And somehow, in the middle of all this, Gustave decided what this marriage needed, drumroll, was another baby. Surely this time would be different, and a new child would soften her. Surely this would be the time that finally made Clémence turn toward him instead of away. Gustave Papin, the insane eternal optimist, absolute disaster. And Clémence seemed to accept that her pregnancies served to quell their perpetual marital conflicts. Léa Isabelle Papin was born September 15th, 1911. She was the last of Clémence's babies, but she was no more wanted than the previous two. And if anyone was holding out hope that the new baby might soften something in this household, it didn't. Shocking. If anything, the dynamics had grown darker, more tangled, more toxic in ways that were becoming harder to look at directly. Because something was shifting with Gustave. His attention and affection, it was turning increasingly toward Émilia, and Clémence noticed. She couldn't stop noticing. She would say with an edge in her voice, "What's gotten into Gustave? It's simply unbelievable how much he loves the little one." And here is where the story gets complicated, because Émilia, by all accounts, was a gentle and empathetic child, the spitting image of her mother, but with none of the coldness. And given that Gustave was, at this point, a man drowning in a loveless marriage, in debt, in disappointment, it makes a certain kind of sense that he leaned into the comfort his daughter offered. But Clémence's account of what that comfort looked like went much further than that. She claimed Gustave was sexually abusing Émilia. And this is where I want to be careful, because we have to look at who is making this claim and what they have shown us about themselves. Clémence did not say, "My husband is a monster. I am taking my daughter and we are leaving." What she said was closer to the language of jealousy, with the perspective that her daughter seduced her own father. And I'm not saying abuse didn't happen. I'm saying we have one source for this claim, a woman who has lied, manipulated, and calculated her way through every difficult moment we have watched her navigate. A woman who, when her husband's attention landed somewhere other than her, even on their own daughter, could not tolerate it. And there's one more thing worth considering. In 1912 France, a woman did not simply leave her husband, not without consequence or scandal. A woman who walked away from her marriage because she was unhappy, conducting affairs for years, or because she had never wanted any of it in the first place, that woman was finished, socially. But a woman leaving an abusive husband, a woman protecting her children from a monster, that woman was sympathetic, reasonable, and could hold her head up in Le Mans and not have the door shut in her face. And get this. In 20th century France, the framework for divorce was fault-based, meaning whoever was the cause of the separation would get less support. And this fault-based divorce system didn't change until 1975. Clémence had been trying to find her way out of this marriage for over a decade, and suddenly, right after Leia's birth, right when she needed an exit most, she had one, a clean one that made her the victim instead of the villain. How convenient. We will never know the full truth of what happened in that attic room, but we know what these people have shown us, and that tells us something about what their motives might have been, and what the truth might actually be. So, it was right after Leia is born that Clémence decides she is going to divorce Gustave. She has the alleged excuse of abuse already, check. It would be filed under Gustave's fault. She just needed the sympathy of the court too, and she would do that by using her children. May 1912, and Clémence pulls Christine from Isabelle's care. And not because, in my opinion, she wanted Christine or because she had suddenly discovered some dormant maternal instinct, but because a woman fighting for divorce in 1912 France could not have her child living with her husband's family. She needed to look like a mother, on paper, who has her children in her care at all times. Plus, the more children were in her care and custody was more financial support she would receive from Gustave. I am convinced that Clémence pulled Christine from Isabelle's because she was worth more money in the courtroom. Christine never spoke about the day she was taken from Isabelle's house, but we don't know what she was told or how it was explained to her or whether anyone explained it at all. We just know that a 7-year-old girl who had spent her entire life in one safe and loving home was taken out of it, and we know she never talked about it, which tells you everything you need to know about what that day cost her, and added to the selfish list of things Clémence was willing to do to get to her bottom line. And it worked. November 1912, legal aid was given to her. And on May 14th, 1913, the judgment was handed down. Clémence Papin was awarded custody and financial support for all 3 of her children. She had constructed a perfect case out of an abuse allegation, 3 children she didn't want, and a legal system that rewarded her for having them. The state paid, Gustave paid, and those 3 beautiful daughters paid the most. Clémence got what she wanted. Freedom from Gustave, financial support from the court, and the moral standing of a wronged woman. Now she just had 3 children to deal with. She had already used them for everything they were worth in that courtroom, and the monthly support payments would keep coming regardless of where the children actually were, so there was no financial reason to keep them close either. Raising them had never been on Clémence's list of intentions, not when they were born, not when she handed them away one by one, and certainly not now. What had not been done in their earliest years was not suddenly going to happen simply because their father was no longer around to share the inconvenience. Clémence had 3 children and a fresh start, and those 2 things were incompatible. So she did what Clémence always did. She got rid of them. For the life of me, I cannot say why Clémence didn't just give Christine back to Isabelle. It would have cost her nothing. Isabelle wanted her. Tell me below, do you think that's exactly why she didn't return Christine to her? Because she was part of Gustave's family and she was wanted? She wanted to punish her daughter for simply being born and taking away any semblance of love? Maybe we wouldn't be here talking about this family today had she just been given back to Isabelle to live out the rest of her life in love and stability. But that's just not what happened. Clémence sent Émilia, age 11 now, and Christine, age 8, to Le Bon Pasteur. At that time, Le Bon Pasteur was run by nuns. They took in rebellious girls, juvenile delinquents, and abandoned children. The institution thus served as a reform school, but it most certainly was not a school. The people of Le Mans did not hold it in high regard. The severity of its rules and the punishments inflicted upon the residents were known far and wide beyond the city limits. It was, so the saying went, nothing less than a penal colony for children. Clémence knew full well that her daughters would suffer there. Parents even used it as a threat. If you aren't good, we'll send you to Le Bon Pasteur. And for the children of Le Mans, there was no worse thing that you could say to them. From the outside, the building is dismal and gray. And from the inside, it's even worse. Long gray corridors that go nowhere. An enormous refectory that echoes. Dormitories so cold you can see your breath, and a silence so heavy it has weight, broken only by the creaking of doors, the drone of hymns, and the sharp reprimands of nuns who had never been gentle. The two sisters only had each other to lean on. Christine was falling apart in ways that were hard to watch. In class, during recitations, panic would seize her completely. Her mind would go blank, her body rigid, and everything Isabelle had taught her about being calm and capable evaporated the moment a nun's eyes landed on her. She had no aptitude for her studies, no intellectual refuge to retreat to. And the threat of a beating, which at Le Bon Pasteur was not an idle threat, left her utterly shattered. Émilia stepped in whenever she could, soothing her with words in the dormitory, a hand on the arm in the refectory, a defiant stare at whoever was making Christine's life smaller that day. The age gap meant they were separated in the classroom with different lessons and different schedules. But the moment they were in the same room again, Émilia made herself known. She had a presence that even the nuns couldn't ignore. Formidable, slightly mischievous, and utterly unbreakable. The other boarders had a saying about her. Émilia is hard as stone, ready to weather any storm. Christine was not as hard as stone, not even kind of, but she was not entirely without fight either. One afternoon, for no apparent reason that anyone could see, she launched herself onto another girl's back. It took a firm hand to pull her off, and Christine herself seemed almost surprised by what her body had done, by the force she hadn't known she even possessed. When the witnesses were summoned before the Mother Superior, they said, "She may have thrown herself at her, but you have to understand, that girl has been terrorizing us for a year. Every chance she gets, she pinches us until we bleed." Christine had not snapped, she had waited. And when she moved for everyone. Little baby toddler Leia was first placed with Clémence's grandfather's sister for a short period of time. Then she was given to Clémence's brother. He lived near, and although he was in poor health and worn down with depression, he visited little Leia every day since her birth and cared about the darling girl. Outside the walls of Les Bons Pasteurs, the world was becoming even darker. In July 1914, a young man named Gavrilo Princip shot and assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria in Sarajevo, which is the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, along the coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. Franz Ferdinand was essentially the crown prince of one of the most powerful empires in Europe. Killing him was like assassinating the future king. And he was killed because Bosnian Serbs didn't want to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And because European countries had alliances, it essentially pulled an entire continent into war practically overnight. And within weeks, almost every major power in Europe was at war because of a chain reaction nobody could stop. And France wasn't just in the war or part of the war. The war came to France's front door because France and Germany had hated each other for decades. Germany had humiliated France in a war in 1870 and taken French territory. So France had been waiting patiently for a rematch. And when the alliance system pulled everyone in, France and Germany ended up on the opposite sides of the fight. And Germany's plan was to march straight through Belgium into France and knock them out fast. France mobilized over 8 million men to fight this war, and the rumors of it spread to Les Bons Pasteurs. They, along with the rest of Europe, said prayers and burned candles for the men at war. and 2 little Papin girls laid in a freezing dormitory night after night and wondered the same thing. Would their father make it home alive? Émilia confided her grief to the Mother Superior, and she tells Émilia, "My daughter, for the salvation of your father's soul, nothing remains to you but prayer." So she prays, and Christine tells a multitude of rosaries. Telling a rosary means you recite a sequence of prayers while moving through a string of rosary beads. Telling a multitude of rosaries means Christine was praying like obsessively. And although it makes sense because everyone was praying for the men at the front, it also was a way to manage extreme anxiety and possibly other psychological conditions that she may have been suffering. And she learned it from Émilia, who was doing the same thing. Repeated actions that give the illusion of control when everything feels out of control. Christine watched Émilia very carefully, how she moved through a hostile world and how she stepped in front of something smaller and more frightened than herself and made it feel less alone. Christine was learning how to be a big sister. I think this is important to note for later. France would suffer a catastrophic loss of over 1 million military deaths and millions more wounded. On one day alone, 27,000 men died. And as news slowly made its way into the departments of France, women began to mourn their husbands and sons daily. And kind of oddly, no one really knows what happened to Gustave. Some accounts say he kept his distance after Clémence's accusations against him. Other references say he disappeared after the start of the war. I think both are possible options, but with no record of death or survival, the most likely answer is the simplest one. France lost 1.4 million men in that war. Most of them working class, and many of them from places exactly like Sarthe, many of them in unmarked graves that nobody ever came back to find. It's 1918, and 4 years into the 6-year war, something else happens. Clémence's brother, the one caring for little Leah, has taken his own life. Now, the war had pushed many people to the edge of what they could bear. So, in isolation, this might read as a tragedy of the times, but I want you to hold it alongside everything else we already know about this family. Clémence, volatile, manipulative, constitutionally incapable of basic human warmth. There was also her cousin who was committed to an asylum, and now a brother dead by his own hand. This is a family with a mental health history, a real one, documented and undeniable. And when you think about what's coming, what Christine will eventually do, and what will happen to her mind in that prison cell, I don't think it's a stretch to connect those dots. For now, Leah is without a home, and Clémence, faced with a traumatized child who has just lost the only consistent present in her life, makes a decision. She placed 7-year-old Leah away from her sisters with the Sisters of St. Charles in Le Mans, because you know what they say, first they isolate, then they control. As Leah moves into a different institution from her sisters, 16-year-old Émilia makes a big decision by taking the veil, assuming the name Sister Marie. Taking the veil means she becomes a nun by entering a convent and committing her life to religious service. Effectively, she was choosing a new life and one that did not include any member of her biological family. For Émilia, given what her family had put her through, this severance reads less like a religious obligation and more like the most rational decision she's ever made. But of course, Christine is devastated. And I don't know, but I imagine she is reliving abandonment trauma. And their mother, Clémence, is in shock. In one rageful letter to her cousins, she said, "When Émilia gets an idea into her head, there's simply no reasoning with her. I have no choice but to give in, though it fills me with bitter regret. For me, it feels as if I were carrying my own daughter to her grave, like a child abduction, yet such an abduction, insofar as it is carried out in the name of God, does not hold the same place, the same value, or the same significance as a criminal abduction. When the abduction is divine, it is acceptable, at least under certain conditions." You see, Émilia's choice to become a nun would ruin Clémence's plan. Le Bon Pasteur wasn't just a place to dump her inconvenient children. Looking at it now with everything we know about Clémence, it was actually quite calculated. First and most obviously, it got rid of them cleanly without the mess of actually abandoning them entirely. She still had legal custody and was still technically their mother. The cord of control remained intact even as she handed them to an institution and walked away. Second, Le Bon Pasteur was known for being cold, rigid, and punishing, and Clémence knew that, and she chose it anyway. I think, for the children, she blamed for the life she never got to have. But third, Le Bon Pasteur trained its residents in domestic arts, housekeeping, cooking, and sewing. Clémence wasn't just warehousing her daughters, she was having them professionally trained in domestic service for free, so that when they were old enough to work, she could pull them out and place them in households across Le Mans to collect their wages. And it worked. For two of her daughters anyway, Émilia took the veil and slipped right through Clémence's fingers, which you can imagine did not go over well for a woman who had spent years engineering exactly this outcome. 3 daughters, 3 incomes, 0 effort. Clémence would never have to work another day in her life. She had simply outsourced the labor of her own survival to the children she had never really wanted in the first place, extracting from them financially what she had never been willing to give them emotionally. She had given them nothing and she intended to take everything. So Émilia becomes a nun and Clémence panics, because if one daughter could be swallowed up by religious devotion inside Le Bon Pasteur walls, what was to stop the other 2 from doing the same? The very institution she had chosen to train her daughters for domestic service had turned around and stolen one of them for God instead. And Clémence could not afford to lose another one. After Émilia entered religious life, she reportedly was never heard from again, which was not uncommon. Many women who took the veil in early 20th century France disappeared into their orders completely. The convent became their entire world, their sisters in faith replacing their sisters in blood. And to be fair, Clémence was right to worry. Christine, now 13 years old, announced she too wanted to become a nun and intend to follow Émilia in the same footsteps. Was it a real spiritual calling? Entirely possible, in that Le Bon Pasteur was a deeply Catholic environment, and prayer had been Christine's coping mechanism since those freezing dormitory nights during the war. Faith may have genuinely taken root in her, but the other possibility is that she held the fear of losing another person. Look at her life so far. Every single person Christine had ever attached herself to had either left or been ripped away. And here was a path that kept her close to the one person who had made Le Bon Pasteur survivable. A way to not be left behind again. For a girl who had experienced that much loss before her teenage years, the convent wasn't necessarily about God, I think. It may have been about not being alone. We'll never really know, but I wonder if even Christine herself knew. But Clémence had a heads up this time, which made all the difference. With Émilia, the deed was already done by the time Clémence found out, and Catholic canon law protected her decision. But Christine was 13 years old, and under Catholic canon law, a girl couldn't make that choice until she was 16 years old, which gave Clémence a window. Whether Christine told her mother directly or Clémence found out another way, we don't really know, but Clémence wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. She didn't need to rush, though. She just needed to get Christine out before she turned 16. And the moment Christine turned 15 in 1920, Clémence pulled her out of Le Bon Pasteur and placed her into domestic service. She was alone now, properly and completely alone. For the first time in her life, she didn't even have a sister. The fruits of her labor can now begin at the home of Mr. Poirier at the bourgeois home on Boulevard Négrier. Clémence collected her daughter's entire wages, and only a small sum was handed back to Christine for her personal purchases. And this next part really breaks my heart. Christine's first placement was with the Poirier family. Reportedly wasn't bad. There was no cruelty or particular hardship. But Christine ran away. Repeatedly. Not from mistreatment or danger, she ran back to the convent where Émilia was, which I think tells you not just about her bond and dependence on that relationship in a sea of disorderly attachments, but that Le Bon Pasteur, that cold, punishing, gray institution that the children of Le Mans were threatened with as the worst possible fate, that was the only consistent thing Christine ever had known. As horrible as it was for her to run back to something like that, it was stable and familiar. But working conditions are harsh with no real rest, let alone vacation. And although all of it, unheated rooms, the 6 a.m. starts, the freezing air, the fires that needed feeding before the rest of the house got up, Christine never complained and always obeyed instructions. She diligently did what she was told with fervor by both her mother and employers. And apparently her needlework skills delighted the bourgeois women of Le Mans. I think Isabelle's lessons absorbed so completely, it had become indistinguishable from her own nature. Be docile, be helpful, ask nothing in return. Or maybe Clémence did enough complaining for the both of them, because of course she was disappointed with the wages Christine earned. It became a pattern so predictable you could set a clock to it. Christine would arrive at a new household, quiet and compliant and hardworking. One employer from March to April 1923, named Mrs. Leroy, called Christine a, quote, gem and said, quote, she is a thoughtful, helpful, and pleasant young woman. She is hardworking, preferring sewing to housework, good-natured, intelligent, and in good health. I have never seen her angry. Christine would learn the routines, master the expectations, make herself indispensable, and she was good at it. And eventually the family would realize what they had, an exceptional employee and someone worth keeping. And then, like clockwork, that was exactly precisely the time when Clémence would appear, dissatisfied with what Christine was earning, pulled her out while negotiating higher wages with a new family, and depositing Christine again in a new house with new strangers starting from nothing, over and over again. A new threshold to cross, a new set of people to prove herself to, a new beginning that wasn't a beginning at all, just another interruption in a life that had never been allowed to settle into anything resembling stability. And here is what is quietly devastating about this pattern. Christine's employers controlled her during the day, dictating her hours, her movements, her duties, her silences. And then Clémence controlled everything else, where she lived, how long she stayed, what her labor was worth. It's 1924 and Christine is walking to her mother's house, but her mother's not home. But there is someone there, a man. It was clear to Christine from the moment she met this man of a few things. 1, he was her mother's lover. 2, he was a disabled war vet. 3, he was a neighbor that moved in and lived with Clémence. And 4, this man was vile. Now, whether this man was vile or not, I'm not actually sure. Because Christine is viewing him from the lens of what she was taught about being averse to men from her Aunt Isabelle. Beware of men, no matter who they are, and never believe a word they say. That said, there are times when not everything can be explained. Our feelings guide us further than our reasons ever could. But this man in her mother's home informs Christine that her mother is not home, but rather has gone out to do her domestic work at Mr. Pateau's home outside of town. What? Gone off to Touffet? So what? She has to earn a living somehow. The little one is with her. With the two of them working together, the pay will be much better. What? You mean to tell me that Leia is with her mother doing housework? Of course. She's taken the girl out of the convent after all. At 13, it's high time she learned the trade. This is typical Clémence, if you ask me. The wages from Christine's job were never enough for her. Not for the life Clémence had decided she deserved anyway. Leia working with her meant the chores got done faster, plus the on-the-job training. A daughter learned the work she could eventually do alone and bring in her own full-time income wages. And it meant that the day Clémence could stop working entirely was one step closer. Christine was horrified. Leah was 13 years old. She had just been pulled from a stable home with the sisters. And now Clémence had reached in and taken that too, putting a 13-year-old child to work alongside her for her mother's own benefit. Christine knew exactly what that had felt like. And now that Leah was back with her mother instead of with the sisters, that following Sunday, Christine and Leah truly found each other for the first time. They had spent virtually their entire lives separated, and now here they were, both of them in the world. Servants in Le Mans were typically given breaks on Sundays from 3 to 6 in the afternoon, 3 hours a week. That was the entirety of their free time. And it was in those 3 hours that Christine and Leah became sisters in the way that actually matters. Not just by blood, but by choice, need, and the specific desperation of two people who had been alone their entire lives and had finally found the one person who understood exactly why. They had found each other, and neither of them were about to let that go. And so, during the first Sunday of their reunification, Christine asks Leah about working for Mr. Pateau with their mother. Leah said, "The work is simple enough, and if only you knew how kind he is." This reunification with Leah was bittersweet for Christine. She had a hard time hearing that Leah was happy working for a man. Her fear of men ran so deep. So much so that she basically forbids her little sister from going back at this point. This is the moment Christine decides that she will have to shoulder the responsibility of raising her younger sister all on her own. But she rises to the challenge and is passionately ready to step into this role. After all, she had learned how to be a mother figure from the love and care of her older sister, Émilia. I think Christine was trying to become something Clémence never was. Present, attentive, someone who actually noticed what was happening to Leah and said something about it. And the fact that Leah left that job with Mr. Pateau not long after Christine demanded it, that's not nothing here, because that's potentially the first real evidence we have of just how much sway Christine already had over her little sister's life. I have no doubt in my mind that Christine wanted to give Leah what Isabelle had given her, safety and someone paying attention. But protection always comes with the protector's baggage attached. And somewhere in there, looking out for someone and controlling someone starts to blur. But I don't think it was ever Christine's intention to control her little sister. Thus far, I see nothing but genuine love and affection. Every minute of freedom Christine had on those brief Sunday afternoons were spent on Leah. Every penny she earned that was not taken by her mother was spent on Leah. If Leah needed anything, Christine told her to ask. And whatever it was, Christine would find a way to get it for her. What Clémence had withheld from both of them their entire lives, Christine was quietly rebuilding from scratch on Sunday afternoons with whatever she had left over to give. So after Clémence and Leah had been working for Mr. Pateau for about 4 months and then quit, Clémence continued to manage Leah's placements with other employers. Just like her sister, Clémence would place Leah and Christine in a service job in a home, wait till they got comfortable, and then pluck them out complaining they were not paid enough, and the cycle would continue. It was always about what Clémence wanted or needed, and Christine and Leah were never included in these decisions. Spring 1925, and Leah is working for Madame Dieuleville, and Christine has been working for Madame Fonteau for about 15 days now, who surprisingly said something literally no other employer has ever dared think or say about Christine. I got rid of her because she had a difficult character. She had a defiant, haughty air about her, and I hesitated to give her orders. This feels whiplash-inducing until you realize what maybe happened here. By Easter that spring, Christine wasn't just visiting Leah anymore. She'd moved in with her. She'd moved in with her at Leah's place of employment and gotten herself hired there too. Their new employer would later say, "As soon as they arrived, I noticed that these two young girls seemed to harbor a deep affection for one another." Could be a coincidence. People change jobs all the time. But knowing what we know about Christine, her almost desperate need to stay close to Leah, to watch over her, and to be the one constant in Leah's life, I wouldn't be shocked personally if Christine engineered this herself. If she got herself let go from the first household specifically because it put her one step closer to wherever Leah was. Tell me what your interpretation of this is in the comments. Clémence kept doing what today we call momaging. She'd place her daughters in a household, wait until they got comfortable, and the moment negotiating higher wages with the employer failed, she'd rip them out and place them somewhere new. This isn't something new. You already know this. The cycle would start over and over, and this is important. I swear, it's almost like Instability was Clémence's whole parenting style. Pull her daughters out of any comfort or stability the second it started to feel like comfort or stability. And it was lucky, honestly, that the sisters got to share an employer at all. Le Mans had a population of roughly 72,000 people, and only about 30 families in this entire city were wealthy enough to employ more than one live-in servant. That the Papin Sisters landed in any of them says something. Not luck alone, but reputation. By this point, word had clearly gotten around. These two girls were worth hiring together. The Papin sisters performed their domestic chores without complaint. Christine goes back to being the model employee, and Leah is described as not talkative, but disciplined, aka obedient. Other employers would go on to make the same sentiment of Leia, but also that Leia defers to Christine completely. And what reminded me of the relationship between Christine and Isabelle, Leia hung onto every word her big sister said. The way Christine had once listened to Isabelle about how to be a good domestic servant, invisible even, but also to never trust the likes of men. And Leia was completely submissive to Christine's every whim, especially when she explained how the world worked. And one thing Christine explained to her, the employers keep a close eye on everything we do. Above all, you must never betray their trust. Don't sneak things behind their backs. Taking from the fruit bowl or the sugar bowl, drinking their wine. In reality, even without you realizing it, they keep a running tally of everything. In other words, trust between a maid and her employer was not given. It was tested. Coins were left deliberately beneath furniture. Would the maid keep them or return them? Keys were hidden to deny access to certain rooms. The sugar, the nuts, the drinks, all inventoried carefully and quietly, updated without the maid's knowledge, checked against what remained. These small traps were laid throughout the house in the first weeks of employment. Not cruelly necessarily, but methodically, because a glowing reference from a previous employer was never enough to establish trust. And this distrustful othering and continued insistence on distinction between classes makes sense, doesn't it? If a maid is, in the eyes of her employers, barely a person, someone whose name isn't even worth remembering, then she's also, by that same logic, someone whose character can't simply be taken on faith. Trust requires seeing someone as a full person, with an inner life and a conscience of her own. And the entire bourgeois household structure was built on doing the opposite of that. So instead of trust, you get surveillance. Quiet, constant, built into the architecture of the house itself. It wasn't really about whether this particular maid might steal a few coins or sip the brandy when no one was looking. It was about a class of people who had decided collectively that the people serving them couldn't be fully known, and thus they would never be fully trusted either. But in the evenings, and for a few hours every Sunday, the world shrinks down to just the two of them, and they could create a world together that only they inhabited. They sewed dresses for each other. Dresses they'll likely never actually wear. Dresses that, if we're being honest, they could never have afforded to own at all. They didn't care. Sometimes they left their room entirely just to walk through town and window shop outside the city's nicest dress boutiques. They'd look at clothes that existed in a world they'd never be allowed into, and then they'd go home and make their own version. Smaller and plainer, but it was theirs. In the 1900s, the bourgeois of this area cared enormously about how their domestic staff appeared. Not who they were as people, but how they looked, carried themselves, and how respectable they seemed, reflecting back onto the household that employed them. Because to the families who hired them, that's largely all the maid was. Appearance and moral character. Beyond that, she didn't need much of an identity at all. In fact, this lack of individual identity went further than most people realize. It was common practice in bourgeois households of this period to simply rename their domestic servants. Learning a new maid's real name required treating her like someone worth remembering. It was easier, apparently, just to keep using the same whatever name the last girl had answered to and let the new one adjust. Which is how, if you look at domestic service records from this era, you'll find the most absurd number of maids that are all named Marie, Louise, and Jean. Not because it was a popular name that everyone had, because employers often didn't bother learning or even using the name a girl actually came into the house with. A maid, in other words, wasn't fully seen as a person with her own name, her own history, and her own interior life. We don't have any record that this happened to Christine or Leia specifically, but it was also common to just call them the maid or you. In any case, it tells you something about how replaceable maids were seen to be as a category of a person in homes they worked in, which makes those evenings in the attic, Christine and Leia alone sewing dresses neither of them would ever wear, feel like something closer to defiance than hobby. In a world that didn't think they needed an identity of their own, they were quietly building one anyway, just for each other. But by this point, Christine and Leia didn't seem to care anymore about their mother moving them around between employers so much. For one thing, they were used to it. They didn't even really have a say in it, so why fight it? This had just been the rhythm of their entire lives. But more importantly, it was enough to be together. The evenings, by most accounts, were more pleasant than you'd expect. The attic rooms they shared were bare, no heat or furniture beyond a bed and a chair. But Christine and Leah had grown up in Bon Pasteur. They knew strictness and austerity, and they adapted without complaint. A bed and a chair was already more than they'd had plenty of nights before. When the sisters were not living with their mother at home and were together working in the same household, it was the happiest they'd ever been. The real warmth came from each other. An arm around the shoulder, a body curled against another body in the cold. No one visited them, and they didn't go looking for anyone to visit. They didn't need to. Each other was truly enough. And this all makes sense to me when you think about the actual implications of a childhood like theirs, specifically the part where stability and security were never something they could count on. When a child grows up like this, placed, displaced, replaced over and over again for years, it changes things. And not in some abstract psychological way either, but in very concrete ones. It changes how you attach to people. Some children in this situation pull away from relationships entirely, almost preemptively, because why get close to anyone or anything if it's just going to be taken away from you? Others go in an opposite direction. They attach so intensely, so completely to whatever stable thing that they do manage to find, and the bond becomes less like a relationship and more like a life raft. It also changes your nervous system. Growing up in chronic instability tends to leave people in a near constant state of low-grade alert. Always scanning for the next disruption, the next threat, even in moments that are, on the surface, completely safe. And maybe most importantly, for two girls like Christine and Leah, it changes your sense of control. When you've spent your entire childhood having every shred of stability ripped away from you again and again, with absolutely no say in the matter, something happens to your relationship with control itself. Some people give up on it entirely. And some people, the moment they finally get a small piece of it, a person, a room, a routine that's actually theirs, hold onto it with an intensity that might look, from the outside, disproportionate. We're not diagnosing Christine and Leah here, because we can't, of course. But it's worth sitting with the fact that by the time these two sisters were finally living under the same roof and completely each other's world, they weren't just close. They were each other's only proof that stability was even possible. One day, while working for a Mrs. Menage, their employer tells Christine, "Please make sure the door handles are properly cleaned. The ones on the first floor aren't shiny enough." Christine is exhausted. Of course she is. Her work is required around the clock with the washing and the cooking and the sweeping and ironing and darning, running errands and so on. It's never ending. She even has to tend to the fireplaces, the toilet, polishing the brass. She barely gets a break, but she knows better than to react out loud. So Christine retreats to the kitchen. She's found a love of cooking by this point, and she's quite good at it too. So she's in the kitchen and she's muttering under her breath and she slams the burners on the stove harder than she probably needs to. And she does it again and again until the noise carries through the house and reaches her madame's ears. A maid who talks back or shows any sort of attitude is all it takes to get fired. There's a reason no bourgeois employer in this area was going to pause and think, well, maybe I was a bit harsh. Or maybe Christine is having just a human moment. And it isn't just personal coldness of the higher class, it was structural. By the 1920s, French class anxiety was running high. The war had gutted the workforce, the economy was unstable, and the bourgeois, the comfortable, respectable middle and upper class families, clung hard to the few visible markers that separated them from everybody they deemed below them. One of those markers was staff. Having servants wasn't just about getting chores done. It was proof that you'd made it. Proof of order, respectability, and control. And control is a key word here. A maid wasn't hired to be a person in that house. She was hired to be an invisible laborer, present enough to do the work, absent enough to never disrupt the household's sense of itself. The moment a maid showed personality, irritation, defiance, or even just like an audible bad mood, she stopped being invisible. And an employer wasn't equipped, culturally or otherwise, to treat that as a human moment. Instead, it read as a threat to the entire arrangement. If the maid was allowed to have moods, what else might she feel entitled to? Opinions? Complaints? Equality? So when Christine gets dismissed on the spot over a few loud pots and irritated mutter, this isn't an overreaction from one particularly strict employer. It's the system functioning exactly as designed. Now, it's unclear if Leah left her position too because Christine was dismissed, or if Madame dismissed them both just as a pair. I could honestly see both being the case, but either way, both sisters found themselves without employment. You can imagine how Clémence took this news. She's furious. If neither of her daughters are bringing in income, then she isn't getting cash either. Clémence needs her daughters placed immediately. 2 daughters out of work at once is a problem she has no intention of repeating. At least one of them needs to be earning at all times, no exceptions. And as she works through her options about what to do, she remembers something an old employer once said about her daughters. Your daughter, Leah, always waits for her sister's answer before speaking. It's rather odd, to say the least. She needs to get out of her shell a bit. I see only one way to do that: separate them. Clémence now realizes that separating her daughters might solve any future issues with unemployment. So that's exactly what she does. She places Christine with the Legay family and Leah with the Nault family. Needless to say, Christine is hurt and enraged. She called her mother outrageous and asked if she was the one being insolent and if that was why she did this. Clémence responded, "No, but you're doing everything you can to control Leah's life to your advantage. As far as I'm concerned, it is my duty as a mother. Leah won't always be with you. When she comes of age, she'll lead her own life. Whether you like it or not, I'm placing you in a job as a cook, and I'm keeping your sister with me as a maid." And I'm genuinely curious what you think here, because we already know Clémence's real motivation for keeping at least one daughter working at all times is really about her own income and security. But 2 unemployed daughters is a financial problem for her. That much is clear. But then she says this thing about motherly duty here, about wanting Leah to be able to stand on her own and to not need Christine for everything, so she's ready for adulthood. And honestly, I think a parent can hold 2 motivations at once, even contradictory ones, and genuinely believe the kinder one is the real motive. So which is it? Is Clémence protecting her own income and dressing it up as parenting? Or does she actually believe what she's saying, that separating the girls is good for Leah, and the financial benefit is just a convenient bonus? Maybe both are true. But I'd love to know what you think. Drop it in the comments. April 1926, and Clémence had placed Christine in the employment of the Lancelin family as a cook. A respectable house and position. Christine arrives with her references, her quiet competence, and all her years of practicing at disappearing into a household without complaint. Nobody in that house has any reason to be afraid of Christine Papin. Not yet. And not even Christine herself knew that in exactly 6 years, 10 months, and 2 days, she and her sister will be standing in this same house, covered head to toe in the Lancelin family's blood. Join me in part 2 of the Papin Sisters story, because what happened in that house is something that not even psychiatrists, philosophers, and criminologists today can explain away. À la prochaine. See you next time.